I think there are 5 logically possible theories as to what happened on the first Easter Sunday. One is the Christian belief that Jesus literally rose from the dead. A second is that Jesus never died on the cross in the first place, but was in a swoon or a trance which was mistaken for death. A third is that he died but didn't rise, and his apostles simply lied. This is the conspiracy theory. A fourth would be that he died but didn't rise, and his apostles sincerely believed they saw him, but were hallucinating. The conspiracy theory says the apostles were deceivers. The hallucination theory says they were deceived. And a fifth theory says they were myth makers, neither deceived nor deceivers, but that the resurrection story was not meant to be interpreted literally. The first of the 5 theories seems the least likely on the face of it. The only convincing argument for this belief would seem to be not any nuancing or revising of the claim in order to make it less shocking, but an examination of the other possibilities and a refutation of each one of them on the basis of data from the text, from history, and from common experience and common sense. Only if the 4 alternatives are thoroughly refutable, and the Christian alternative is not, does there seem to be good logical reason to believe the Christian alternative. So let's see how strong that case is. The swoon theory seems the easiest one to refute. For one thing, Jesus could never have survived crucifixion. Roman procedures were very careful to eliminate that possibility. They had to have certain medical proof that the condemned man was dead. And his disciple John, who claims to have been there, certified that he saw water as well as blood come from Jesus' heart when the soldier's lance pierced it, showing that his lungs had collapsed and he had died of asphyxiation. For another thing, how could armed Roman guards at the tomb have been overpowered by a swooning semi-corpse? And how could a man in a swoon move the great stone at the door of the tomb, which it took 2 or 3 strong Romans to move? Finally, if Jesus awoke from a swoon, where did he go? There's absolutely no trail, no claims, no stories, or myths, or fantasies even, about Jesus after his crucifixion, except the stories in the Gospels. Much more promising seems the conspiracy theory. People often lie. There's plenty of precedent for that. Why couldn't the Gospel writers have simply made up the whole story? Well, the strongest reason is that they were almost all martyred for it. Now, martyrdom doesn't prove the truth of the belief you die for. You may be ignorant or a fanatic, but it certainly proves your sincerity in believing it. Liars don't die for elaborate practical jokes. Lies are always told for some selfish advantage. What advantage did Jesus' disciples get from their lie? They were hated, persecuted, excommunicated, imprisoned, tortured, exiled, crucified, fed to lions, and all the enemies of this new movement wanted to wipe it out. So all they would have had to do was to bribe one apostle to deny his story, and it would have ended. No one would have believed it. And yet no one ever confessed that it was a lie, a conspiracy. Also, if it was a lie, then Jesus was dead, and both the Jews and the Romans would have been able to produce the corpse, to prove that to everybody, and this new Christian movement, which they both feared, would have been totally dead in the water. So where was the body? And if the disciples stole the body, how did they overpower the armed Roman guards when they were on duty? The penalty for sleeping on duty in Roman law was death. Let's examine the third possibility, that it was a hallucination. That seems reasonable. If you saw a man who had just been executed walking around and talking, wouldn't you think it more likely that you were hallucinating than that you were seeing what was? But then why didn't the apostles think that? Well, according to the Gospels, they did. And to prove that he was not a hallucination or a ghost, he let them touch him and he ate their food. And there seem to have been far too many witnesses for a hallucination. Hallucinations are always private and individual. Mass hallucinations occasionally happen, but only together. Whereas Jesus appeared separately, according to the story, to many different people on many different occasions. And Paul even mentions in one of his letters that Jesus appeared to 500 people, most of whom are still alive, thus inviting his readers to check it out by questioning those almost 500 eyewitnesses. And we don't know of any hallucination that ever behaved as Jesus did in the gospel story. Hallucinations don't eat, and they're not touched. Figments of your imagination don't hold profound, extended conversations with you. And if Jesus' corpse had still been in the tomb, the disciples wouldn't have believed the hallucination. They would check it out and refute it. And if they were hallucinating and Jesus really was dead, then once they started to spread their story, the Jews and Romans would have been able to stop the whole Christian movement and refute the story simply by producing the corpse. So the most likely alternative to a real resurrection would be a myth. And that's the most popular position today. Myth was a common form of religious literature in the first century, and fantastic and exaggerated mythic accounts of some great religious founder, complete with stories of miracles, often did grow up and replace the simpler historical facts in people's minds once the facts of the founder had been forgotten. To a certain extent, that even happened to Buddha, to Lao Tzu, and Muhammad. Why couldn't it have happened to Jesus? For one thing, the style of the Gospels looks radically different from the style of myths. They look like and claim to be eyewitness descriptions. If they're not that, then they are the world's most successful realistic fantasy, invented 19 centuries before Tolkien. Detail that distinguishes the Gospels from myths is that the first witnesses of Jesus' resurrection were women. In first century Judaism, women had no legal status and no right to serve as witnesses. They were regarded as unreliable, and their testimony was regarded as worthless legally. So if the empty tomb was an invention, a legend, the inventors would certainly not have made it to be discovered by women. Another problem is that there was not enough time for the myth to develop. Several generations have to pass before the invented mythic elements can be mistakenly believed to be historical facts, because the eyewitnesses who remembered the real religious founder would refute the myth otherwise. Now, some scholars dispute the first century date for the Gospels, though more evidence seems to be accumulating for it, but no scholar disputes that Paul's letters were written before 55 or 60 AD when he was martyred, and that was well within the lifetime of many eyewitnesses. But Jesus' literal resurrection is central to Paul's teachings. There is simply no example anywhere in history of a great myth or legend arising around a historical figure and being widely believed within 30 years of that figure's death. Also, there is a simple textual proof that the New Testament can't be a myth, which Christians confused with literal fact, because it specifically distinguishes the two and refutes the mythic interpretation, for instance in 1 Corinthians 15 and in 2 Peter. And if it explicitly says it's not a myth, then if it is a myth, it's a deliberate lie rather than a myth. So we're back to the old dilemma: the apostles were either deceived or deceivers. What could a non-Christian answer to this argument? First, he could point to the logical weakness of the quintilemma, the five-part dilemma, in its logical form, so it's only a matter of probability and not proof. And even more crucially, you have to be sure your alternative possibilities are exhaustive, that there is no sixth possibility in addition to these five, and that it is impossible in principle. Well, any disjunctive syllogism, any either-or syllogism, in the form of it's either A or B, it's not A, therefore it must be B, has a weak first premise. How can you ever prove that it must be either A or B? That tomorrow someone won't come up with a C, another alternative that no one thought of today. A second answer the skeptic could give is by rehabilitating the mythic hypothesis. History is not an exact science, and neither is textual scholarship. Documents can be forged. Anyone can claim anything in print. This historical skepticism can be extended to any historical figure, of course. We can't be certain that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, or that Socrates drank the hemlock, or that St. Augustine was converted in a garden. But the reason no one doubts those events is not merely the documents that narrate them, but the nature of the events they narrate. No one claims Caesar rose from the dead. So the issue comes down to the philosophical issue of miracles rather than the historical issue of date and authorship of texts. You see, upon logical analysis, all or most of the issues turn out to be connected and dependent on each other. A kind of package deal.